For as long as complex financial systems have existed, they have shared a quiet habit. Long before visible crisis, long before headlines or panic, capital begins to move. Not loudly, not dramatically. It shifts direction the way water does when the slope changes, subtly at first, then all at once. The people living inside the system rarely notice. The people managing the system always do. This pattern is older than modern markets. It appeared in late Roman trade routes, when silver drained eastward, while officials insisted prosperity remained intact. It appeared in Renaissance banking centers, when merchant houses quietly diversified out of sovereign debt just as states expanded it. It appeared again in the twilight of European empires, when capital retreated from public obligation and flowed into private insulation, decades before flags were lowered. The signal is never collapse itself. The signal is reallocation. When large pools of capital move, they do not announce moral judgments. They do not act out of fear or optimism. They respond to incentives, probabilities, and asymmetries. They move away from fragility and toward durability, away from promises and toward control, away from systems that require confidence and toward structures that survive without it. Historically, these shifts happen during periods of apparent stability. Asset prices remain high, institutions appear credible, official narratives emphasize resilience and adaptation. But beneath the surface, balance sheets stretch, leverage compounds, and productivity weakens. Returns increasingly depend not on growth, but on liquidity. Wealth circulates faster, yet settles less often, and then something else begins to happen. Capital stops reinforcing the system that created it. This is the moment most people miss because nothing looks broken yet. Employment holds, markets function, political arguments consume attention. But in the background, the largest allocators quietly change posture. They reduce exposure to generalized risk. They increase exposure to assets that benefit from fragmentation, volatility, and scarcity. They prepare not for collapse, but for asymmetry. In past cycles, this phase lasted years, sometimes decades. Those inside the system interpreted it as sophistication, innovation, financial evolution. Only later did it become obvious that the system had already crossed a threshold, one where sustaining itself required ever-increasing intervention, ever-expanding balance sheets, and ever greater faith in narratives that no longer matched incentives. What matters is not whether collapse comes suddenly or slowly. What matters is that once capital begins treating the system itself as a risk factor rather than a foundation, the outcome is already constrained. In recent months, a shift of roughly $2 trillion occurred within the world's most influential asset manager. Not a withdrawal, not a crash, a repositioning, largely internal, largely technical, almost entirely ignored by public conversation. But history suggests that when capital of that scale quietly changes its assumptions, the system is no longer in its early phase. It is already further along than most people realize. Large-scale systemic collapse does not arrive the way people expect. It does not begin with panic or disorder. It does not announce itself through political rupture or military defeat. It begins as an accounting problem. A mismatch between what a system promises and what it can sustainably produce. In functioning systems, production precedes consumption. Value is created, then distributed. Over time, as systems mature and complexity increases, that order subtly reverses. Consumption becomes protected. Promises become entrenched. Production becomes increasingly financial rather than real. Growth continues, but it relies less on output and more on credit, leverage, and narrative reinforcement. This is where collapse truly begins, not in chaos, but in normalization. At first, the changes feel benign. Debt rises, but it is framed as investment. Monetary expansion accelerates, but it is described as stabilization. Productivity growth slows, but asset prices rise fast enough to conceal it. The system still works. In fact, it often appears to work better than before. Liquidity smooths over inefficiency. Intervention replaces discipline. Then the stages unfold. The first stage is expansion beyond productive capacity. Obligations grow faster than real output, but the difference is financed. The system learns that constraints can be postponed. The second stage is monetary distortion. Money becomes less a measure of value and more a policy tool. Prices stop communicating scarcity accurately. Risk is underpriced, not because participants are irrational, but because the system rewards those who assume it. The third stage is debt dependency. Growth becomes inseparable from borrowing, not just public borrowing, but private leverage layered across households, corporations, and financial institutions. Servicing past obligations becomes as important as creating new value. The fourth stage is incentive decay. Capital flows toward financial engineering rather than productive enterprise. Returns are generated through access, scale, and proximity to liquidity, not innovation or efficiency. Inequality widens, not as a moral failure, but as a structural outcome. The fifth stage is confidence maintenance. Institutions devote increasing energy to preserving belief in stability. Narratives harden. Dissenting signals are framed as misunderstanding rather than warning. Volatility is treated as an external threat rather than an internal symptom. The final stage arrives quietly. The system becomes irreversible. Not because collapse is imminent, but because correction is no longer politically, socially, or financially tolerable. Any attempt to restore discipline would cause immediate damage greater than continuing distortion. From this point forward, outcomes narrow. Throughout this process, nothing breaks in the conventional sense. Markets remain open, governments function, corporations report profits. But the system's internal logic changes. Stability now depends on perpetual intervention, growth depends on expanding balance sheets, and confidence becomes the primary commodity being managed. This is why collapse feels slow until it isn't, because each stage reinforces the next. Each adjustment teaches participants that the system will protect itself, and for a long time, it does. But capital, especially at scale, does not confuse durability with permanence. It watches incentives. It watches flows. It watches the growing distance between real output and financial claims. And when that distance becomes structural rather than cyclical, capital begins to prepare for a different environment, one where the system still functions, but no longer anchors value the way it once did. That is when the pattern moves from theory into history. One of the clearest examples of this pattern unfolded not in a moment of invasion or revolution, but during the long maturity of the Roman Empire. Rome's rise was built on genuine structural advantages. Military discipline secured trade routes. Legal uniformity reduced friction across vast distances. Infrastructure connected production centers to consumption hubs with unprecedented efficiency. For centuries, Rome converted conquest into stability and stability into growth. Wealth flowed inward, taxes were collected in hard currency, and productivity expanded across agriculture, mining, and trade. But success carried a cost. As territorial expansion slowed, so did the inflow of new resources. The empire remained vast, but the engine that sustained it began to strain. Administrative complexity increased. Military spending became permanent rather than episodic. Social expectations hardened around benefits, distributions, and protection. To maintain cohesion, Rome turned increasingly to monetary adjustment. Silver content in coinage declined gradually at first, almost imperceptibly. Each debasement solved an immediate problem: paying soldiers, funding grain distributions, servicing obligations, without addressing the underlying imbalance. Prices rose, but unevenly. Those closest to the state adjusted. Those furthest from power absorbed the loss. Debt accumulated not just financially, but institutionally. Bureaucracies multiplied, tax burdens intensified on productive classes while elites sought exemption. Land ownership consolidated. Small producers disappeared. Output stagnated, even as consumption expectations remained fixed. This is where Rome entered the critical phase. Wealth still flowed through the system, but it no longer stayed within it. Capital moved into land, titles, and political insulation rather than enterprise. Trade continued, but incentives shifted away from innovation and toward preservation. The economy became less dynamic, more extractive. The empire still looked powerful, its armies still marched, its cities still stood. But its internal circulation had weakened. Social consequences followed predictably. Trust eroded between state and citizen. Tax compliance required coercion, currency lost credibility. Barter returned in regions once fully monetized. Productivity declined further as participation became less rewarding than avoidance. Importantly, none of this felt like collapse at the time. It felt like management. Reform after reform was introduced. Price controls, compulsory professions, centralized planning of labor and goods. Each intervention addressed symptoms while further constraining flexibility. By the time Rome faced external pressure, the outcome was already determined. The system could no longer adapt. It could only defend its existing structure, even as that structure required ever greater effort to sustain. Rome did not fall because barbarians crossed its borders. Borders had been crossed before. Rome fell because its internal incentives no longer supported growth, resilience, or renewal. The empire had become financially rigid long before it became militarily vulnerable. The lesson is not about ancient politics or military failure, it is about flow. Rome's wealth continued to circulate, but it increasingly bypassed productive reinvestment. Value was extracted, redistributed, and preserved, rarely expanded. That is the moment systems rarely recover from, when capital still moves but no longer builds. History remembers the end as sudden. The pattern reveals it was anything but. A similar conviction appeared centuries later at the height of the British Empire. By the late 19th century, Britain had constructed the most extensive commercial and financial network the world had ever seen. Its navy secured sea lanes, its legal system underpinned contracts across continents. The pound sterling functioned as global money, trusted not by decree, but by habit and dominance. London became the clearinghouse of the world. Capital flowed in effortlessly. British debt was considered risk-free. The empire could borrow cheaply, trade freely, and project power without exhausting its domestic base. For a time, the system appeared self-sustaining. And this was precisely why warning signs were dismissed. As industrial competitors emerged, Britain's relative productivity began to decline. Manufacturing leadership slipped quietly to newer, faster economies. Domestic investment shifted away from industry and toward overseas assets and financial services. Returns remained strong, but they came increasingly from ownership rather than production. Debt rose gradually, then structurally. Maintaining imperial commitments required constant expenditure. Social programs expanded at home. The system compensated not through growth, but through leverage and confidence. Sterling's status absorbed the strain. This fostered a dangerous belief that Britain's position was structural, not conditional, that the system had evolved beyond historical constraint, that financial centrality could substitute indefinitely for productive dominance. The stages repeated with remarkable precision. Monetary flexibility increased, gold convertibility was strained, suspended, restored, and strained again. Each intervention was framed as temporary, each became permanent. Capital allocation favored stability over renewal. The financial sector flourished while industrial capacity aged. After the First World War, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Britain attempted to restore the pre-war monetary order, not because it was viable, but because abandoning it threatened credibility. The result was deflation, unemployment, and suppressed growth. The system was preserved in form, but weakened in substance. Denial persisted. The pound remained central. London remained influential. Official narratives emphasized resilience and tradition. But capital had already begun to behave differently. Long-term investment shifted abroad. The empire increasingly relied on external financing to sustain itself. When the break finally came, it was not dramatic. There was no single collapse. Sterling declined in stages. Influence narrowed. Obligations were renegotiated. The transition unfolded over decades, not months. What made this episode distinct was the confidence with which it was misunderstood. The assumption that institutional prestige could override structural reality delayed adjustment until options were constrained. By the time change became unavoidable, it was no longer strategic. It was reactive. The British system did not fail because it lacked intelligence or competence. It failed because it mistook continuity for permanence, because it believed adaptation could be deferred indefinitely without cost. This is how "this time is different" usually sounds in hindsight. Not arrogant, just reasonable, just incremental, just late. And once again, the pattern held. When incentives stopped rewarding renewal, capital adjusted first. The rest followed. The modern system operates on a scale and speed unlike anything in history, but its structure remains familiar. It is anchored not by territory or empire, but by financial architecture, by deep liquid markets, by reserve currencies, by institutions designed to absorb shock and distribute risk across time. For decades, this system has been extraordinarily effective. Global trade expanded, capital mobility increased, consumption rose faster than population, asset ownership became the primary engine of wealth creation. Stability was no longer something earned through discipline alone, but something actively managed. Debt became a feature rather than a flaw. Public deficits expanded to smooth cycles. Private leverage increased to amplify returns. Monetary policy evolved from constraint to coordination. Each shift was rational in isolation. Each solved an immediate problem. Together, they produced a system where growth relied increasingly on balance sheet expansion rather than productivity gains. In this environment, incentives changed. Capital flowed toward scale, liquidity, and policy proximity. Financial engineering outperformed physical investment. Risk was not eliminated, but redistributed, often invisibly. Confidence became self-reinforcing because too many institutions depended on its continuation to allow disruption. This is the context in which modern asset managers rose to prominence. They did not create the system. They optimized within it. They aggregated capital, diversified exposure, and reduced volatility for millions of participants. In doing so, they became systemic themselves. When institutions reach this size, their internal decisions matter less as strategies and more as signals. Not because they predict the future, but because they reflect collective incentive assessment at scale. In recent years, structural pressures have intensified. Sovereign debt has grown faster than output. Monetary expansion has become normalized rather than exceptional. Productivity improvements have struggled to match financial growth. Asset prices have absorbed liquidity that real economies have not. None of this implies imminent failure. Systems like this can persist for long periods. What it does imply is sensitivity. Small changes in confidence, policy, or flow can have outsized effects. This is where the modern parallel becomes clear. When capital managers begin reallocating internally toward assets that benefit from fragmentation, scarcity, and volatility, away from broad-based exposure to generalized stability, they are not expressing fear. They are acknowledging constraint. They are recognizing that the system's future performance depends less on expansion and more on distribution. The shift is subtle. It appears technical. It is framed as optimization. But it reflects a deeper assumption that the environment ahead will reward positioning more than participation. History does not require villains to repeat itself. It requires incentives that no longer align with long-term renewal. When maintaining stability becomes more valuable than generating growth, capital adapts accordingly, and adaptation, at scale, quietly reshapes the system long before any crisis is named. Late-stage systems always feel most stable just before they lose flexibility. This is not coincidence, it is design. By the time a system reaches this phase, it has accumulated layers of protection. Policies exist to dampen volatility. Institutions coordinate to prevent shocks from propagating. Market participants internalize the expectation of intervention. Risk does not disappear, but it becomes normalized, treated as manageable, insurable, and temporary. This creates a powerful illusion of control. As pressures build, responses become faster and more forceful. Liquidity is deployed preemptively. Narratives emphasize resilience, adaptation, and learning. Each successful stabilization reinforces confidence that the system can handle the next disturbance as well. The absence of collapse is interpreted as proof of durability. But underneath this surface calm, something critical is changing. Interventions begin to pull future stability into the present. Each action reduces optionality. Each rescue narrows the range of acceptable outcomes. Over time, the system becomes dependent on continuous reinforcement. It still functions, but only under increasingly specific conditions. At this stage, warning signals are not ignored because they are invisible. They are ignored because acknowledging them would require choices that are no longer tolerable. Correction would mean losses that institutions, markets, and governments have structured themselves to avoid. Delay becomes the least disruptive option, even as it compounds fragility. Narrative control intensifies not out of malice, but necessity. Stability must be believed in to function. Doubt becomes a systemic risk. Volatility is framed as external noise rather than internal feedback. Risk models adjust to recent calm, reinforcing exposure precisely when conditions are most brittle. Capital responds accordingly. Large allocators do not exit the system, they reposition within it. They favor assets that retain value under multiple regimes. They seek structures that benefit from dispersion rather than uniform growth. They prepare for a world where correlations shift and guarantees weaken. To observers, this looks like sophistication. To historians, it looks familiar. Acceleration does not begin with collapse. It begins when the system can no longer slow itself down without breaking something important. From that point forward, events feel manageable, until they are not. Changes that once unfolded over decades compress into years. Adjustments that were once optional become mandatory. By the time deterioration becomes visible to everyone, it is already well advanced. Not because no one warned of it, but because the cost of acting early always felt higher than the cost of waiting. That is how acceleration works. Quietly, rationally, all at once. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because the structures we build respond to incentives more reliably than to intention. Each generation inherits systems that worked before, modifies them to solve present problems, and gradually shifts their internal logic without fully noticing the long-term consequences. Collapse, when it comes, is rarely the result of malice or incompetence. It emerges from reasonable decisions made under constraint, from efforts to preserve stability, from the desire to avoid pain today, even if it means accepting greater risk tomorrow. No single actor chooses the outcome. The outcome is chosen collectively, through alignment. What endures across centuries is not the form of the system, but the pattern of behavior inside it. When productivity slows, systems borrow time. When obligations grow, they monetize flexibility. When confidence becomes fragile, they manage narratives. Each step is defensible. Each step works until it doesn't. And by the time the limits are reached, the system has usually trained itself to depend on the very mechanisms that prevent reversal. This is why large reallocations of capital matter. Not because they cause collapse, but because they reflect adaptation to a changing incentive landscape. Capital is not prophetic. It is reactive. It moves toward environments where outcomes are less dependent on collective belief and more grounded in structure. The story is never about one firm, one policy, or one moment. It is about flow, about where value is allowed to accumulate, where it is encouraged to circulate, and where it is quietly prevented from settling. When those pathways distort, systems do not immediately fail. They transform, often in ways that feel abstract at first, technical, manageable, until they aren't. Every major transition in history looked ordinary while it was happening. People still worked, markets still opened, institutions still issued confident statements. Only later did it become clear that the underlying rules had changed. That recognition rarely arrives with drama. It arrives with hindsight. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.